Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure to have you with us this morning. I represent the Global Warming Policy Foundation. We are a climate and energy think tank founded by Nigel Lawson back in 2009 because he felt that the impacts of climate policies were having more negative effects than what we were seeing from climate change itself, and it's a hypothesis that I think has been vindicated by the incredibly damaging results of the Climate Change Act and various other initiatives that we've seen here in the UK in particular, but around the world over the last 20 years. And those results have been devastating. They've meant people have lost their jobs, whole industries have been decimated, and we are now in a situation where Britain has the highest energy costs, or amongst the highest energy costs in the developing world, with all the results that entail from that. The discussion today is about, can Britain survive Ed Miliband? Ed Miliband, of course, is the figurehead of the Climate Change Act and Net Zero, which force whoever is Secretary of State for Energy to follow net zero, to make sure every sector meets net zero, and therefore, it is more than Ed Miliband. It is an agenda that is underpinned by legislation, and it was incredibly encouraging to hear Claire Coutinho and Kemi Badenoch talk about the need to now scrap the Climate Change Act. So we're delighted to hear that, and we're delighted to have an excellent panel with us today. We have Lord Offord, a businessman and former parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Exports, now Shadow Energy and Net Zero Minister in the House of Lords. Catherine Porter, who's an independent energy consultant and director of and founder of the excellent energy blog What Logic, and Andy Meyer, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with as an energy analyst and Director of Operations at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So without further ado, can I welcome Catherine to give some opening remarks?
Hello, everyone. We're asked to speak about whether Britain can withstand Ed Miliband. So you may recall that a few months ago, Ed Miliband told us in song with his ukulele that the answer is blowing in the wind. I think we can withstand that for an extremely short amount of time. Ed Miliband tells us on a regular basis that there's a climate emergency, that we face high energy costs as a result of high gas prices, and that, and Andy will come on to this exposes us to all sorts of nasty dictators, including Norway, apparently. That the only solution to these challenges is to get off gas and to install renewables, which are cheap. And the justification for this is that there is a climate emergency. What we actually have is, as Harry just told us, we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world and the fourth highest domestic electricity prices in the developed world. We are not the only country in the world that imports gas or uses it for electricity generation. So why is it that we have the highest prices and not some other gas importer that is paying international gas prices for their gas? We are all paying essentially a similar price of gas. Gas prices have fallen by 84% since their highs in 2022. In fact, by the end of this year, there'll be enough new LNG to fully replace Russian gas in the global markets. And next year, we expect the global gas markets to go into length. This will mean that gas prices return to their long-term average. And what people forget is that for 25 years, before COVID, before the end of 2021, gas prices were low and they were stable. But from 2006 onwards, our electricity prices started to rise. And if you look at the long-term trend of wholesale gas prices go back to the late 1990s. Up until the end of 2021, they were low and stable. The wholesale electricity price was, as you'd expect, the wholesale gas price plus a small margin. And up until 2006, the retail electricity price, so the price that households and businesses paid, was the wholesale price of electricity with a little bit added on. And that makes sense because you've got to pay to move the electricity through the networks to bring it from the power stations to your home. You have suppliers that have to pay the charges for the network companies and do billing and have call centers and so on. There's a bit of VAT. So you expect that to happen, to be a margin above. And it was fairly stable. But from 2006 onwards, you saw a divergence between what we were spending on electricity at the retail level, households and businesses, and the wholesale price. So wholesale gas and electricity prices continued to be low and stable, but our bills were going up. And by 2021, they'd gone up hugely. In fact, when the gas crisis happened, the wholesale electricity price actually jumped up to meet the price that we were paying. And then it came down, but we have not seen a corresponding reduction in bills. The reason for that divergence was the cost of net zero. It was the cost of trying to decarbonize. We're told that renewables are cheap. And people think, well, that makes sense because the wind and the sun are free. We don't have to pay for sunshine. But the machines that you need to turn wind and sun into electricity, they're not free. They're actually very expensive. And so you have to provide a subsidy for that. And initially we were informed that these subsidies were to stimulate a market that was immature and that eventually these subsidies would taper away. So we started those subsidies in 1990. It's now been 35 years. If your market's not mature after 35 years, it's really never going to be. And not only are we not seeing subsidies decline, we're seeing them increase. They're going to increase. The new subsidy round, which is going to be announced the results will be announced in the next few months. That is going to be the highest one that we've seen in a long time. And those contracts are going to be not 15 years, which they have been up until now, they'll be 20 years. So these are not characteristics of a technology which is cheap. These are characteristics of a technology which is expensive. But we don't only pay the subsidy. It's not always windy and sunny. So we have to pay other types of generation and batteries to be available to run when it's not windy and sunny. We have to manage the fact that from moment to moment, the output changes, and this can create stability issues on the grid that have to be managed. We call this balancing, and that's adding billions of pounds a year to costs. We have to connect these renewables. They have low energy density, so the amount of wires that you need to connect them is much higher. If I want to connect an 800 megawatt gas station, which is the size of a decent gas power station, to the grid, I need one set of wires. An equivalent amount of electricity from wind is 60 turbines. But wind only works a third of the time. So to give basically the same annual amount of electricity, and gas is probably about 86% of the time, you need about 150 turbines. So 150 times more wires than for your gas power station. Those costs all get added onto bills. And then, just in case we didn't think all of that was crazy enough, we thought it would be a really, really good idea to connect wind farms to the grid, despite the fact we cannot actually take the electricity they generate to consumers. We built, and the worst example is a wind farm called Seagreen. And that opened in October 2023. In 2024, 2/3 of its output had to be wasted. And we pay twice when that happens. We pay a gas power station to generate the electricity we use, and then we pay the wind farm to turn off. And all of these costs get added to bills. So in fact, renewables are not cheap. Gas is not the reason that we have expensive bills. And the climate emergency, The consequence of having high energy costs is that our factories are closing. And those factories are moving to countries like China, where their energy has a higher carbon content than ours does. And then the goods that are made in those factories that we need here in Britain have to be shipped back to the UK on boats that emit carbon dioxide. So the carbon emissions associated with our consumption go up. So our net zero policy is destroying the economy, it's destroying households and pushing households into fuel poverty, and it's increasing global emissions. So if you care about the climate and you care about the economy, you should absolutely be opposed to this policy. And getting rid of the Net Zero Target and the Climate Change Act is in no way incompatible with climate stewardship, because our current policy makes those climate parameters worse. And this is all being perpetuated by Ed Miliband, who does not seem to understand these basic facts.
Thank you, Catherine. Andy.
Great. Well, thank you, Harry, and thank you, Catherine. So the essay question today is, can the UK survive Ed Miliband? And the short answer to the question is yes. Ed Miliband, as Robin Day once said, is a here today, gone tomorrow politician, while the United Kingdom, I'm pleased to say, is rather more robust, fingers crossed. The main tragedy of Ed Miliband is that he thinks he's doing good and helping, if not the country, at the very least the collective future of humanity. He clearly thinks he's saving the world. I'm going to contend otherwise. Now, Catherine expertly covered the main issues alluding to energy affordability and security, but the fundamental duty of any government is national security, or the defence of the realm. And here I suggest Miliband's policies are a threat. Our defence reasonably requires dispatchable power, not just to house, warm and transport the 135,000 personnel of the British Armed Services, but crucially the machinery of war, which runs almost exclusively on various grades of oil. Not to mention their supply chains, which are heavily dependent on both oil and gas in every country on Earth, not just here. The Air Force is the most thirsty, requiring around 700,000 litres of aviation fuel a year. Meanwhile, a single army division of 10,000 soldiers can consume 800,000 litres of diesel in a single day when engaged in active operations. Even the Navy's nuclear submarines have diesel generators for essential systems and restarting the reactor. There are, of course, a myriad of government initiatives to change this, from jet zero ambitions for the RAF by 2040 to sustainable propulsion in boats and hybrid architecture for the Challenger 3 tank for the Army. The main thing these programmes all have in common is being decades away from either commercialisation, let alone combat readiness. I strongly suspect, but do not know, that the Russian Air Force does not fear engagement with Project Martin. If you've not heard of this, this is an RAF microlight aircraft powered by synthetic UL-91 gasoline. The Treasury, though, does fear it, because the sustainable aviation fuels, which are the bedrock of efforts to decarbonise flight, cost 10 times as much as conventional kerosene, and they won't fall that far. There are clearly areas in the military where electrification makes sense. Combat drones use both battery and diesel technology, and the really small ones are rechargeable. These are changing tactics worldwide, as we can see in Ukraine. That's mainly because of the way they enable new battlefield rules of engagement in force projection and defence, not in their emissions profile. We do then, for now, remain a world where combat readiness relies on fossil fuels for which access to secure supply remains as crucial as it ever was. So we perhaps need to remind ourselves of, as the Kremlin buzzes European airspace, that the Allies' relative ability to access fossil fuels was crucial in the defeat of Germany and Japan in World War II. The US sent us the Roughnecks of Sherwood Forest, or the Oil Patch Warriors, to secretly drill on shore under tree cover in 1943. While U-boats were sinking tankers in the Atlantic, they added over 1 million barrels to our supplies, including those used for D-Day. Meanwhile, Russia has clearly used their sanction-busting reserves to finance the war in Ukraine, and more importantly perhaps, their calculation for invasion in the first place was a belief that the EU's dependence on them would make the Allies resist interfering. Europe's capitals are still arguing today, with Hungary and Slovakia in particular, that, whether or not they need to break away from Russian supply. Ukraine, meanwhile, is making strategic gains in the war by targeting Russia's oil infrastructure. It's a fossil fuel war. So why did Putin believe this? Well, some suggest he did fund anti-fracking campaigns in the UK, but underlying this, it was our addiction to net zero, due to particularly the leave it in the ground idiocy that it inspired and amplified further by even crazier campaigns in places like Germany to ban nuclear power alongside fossil fuels, the only net zero technology that actually might work. So it's a cruel irony of history that one of the reasons nationalist Russia could invade Ukraine is that Soviet Russia was so hopeless at running a Ukrainian nuclear power station at Chernobyl that public confidence in an industry was undermined. Either way, after decades of campaigns, Germany bet the farm that Putin could be trusted and built Nord Stream 1 and 2. How wrong they were. China, conversely, has been fossil fuel import dependent throughout most of recent history, and that possibly means that they have been restrained in their engagement with neighbours, though perhaps not restrained enough. They are particularly vulnerable to action in the Straits of Malacca, and more reasonably, if there were any threats towards Taiwan, the US would likely intervene in the Middle East to stop their main source of supply. The Middle East itself would be far more powerful and dangerous today were it not for the US's decision to permit fracking and reverse the expectations of history, where the West was supposed to become ever more dependent on the Middle East in the 21st century. So oil still matters. Oil geopolitics still matters. And whatever wind farm kabuki theatre Ed Miliband watches to convince himself otherwise, he's not right. It is then imperative to British security and to the Western Alliance that we at all times maintain access to our own resources. Claire Coutinho, although not exactly making this point, was dead right yesterday when she referred to Miliband's policies as unilateral economic disarmament. So what risks is he actually taking? The UK does not, like some countries, have a strategic gas reserve, or rather ours is 9 days versus 90 to 120 days for France, the Netherlands and Germany. But the truth is we've never needed one. We had the North Sea, something Ed Miliband would happily leave fallow. We do have oil reserves, or rather private industry holds around 61 days average consumption in stock, but this becomes markedly more difficult to use when refineries like Grangemouth and terminals like Lindsey are being closed or downsized as a result of neglect. We retain a small amount of coal for what is left of the steel industry after the last coal-fired power station closed last year, but we still have tons of the stuff in the hills, just nowhere to use it. It begs belief that leave it in the ground, the philosophy driving Ed Miliband's ongoing assault on these resources, has been treated as a rational position. We already know it's a fool's errand as it concerns decarbonisation. As Catherine said, the UK's emission profile depends on demand for fossil fuels, not supply, and importing produces more emissions than domestic production. We already know it's fiscally imprudent. The fuels we import are not just the taxes we don't raise in our own supply, but subsidies paid to fund others. Just as a historic analogy, we ditched the Danegeld in 1016 with the equivalent of £2.4 billion by paying 72,000 pounds of silver to Canute's Viking invaders, a time in history when small boats were even more challenging than they are today. But that payment represents just 1/10 of the value of our annual imports of fossil fuels from Norway today. So those Norwegian exports are taxed, the proceeds funneled into the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, a percentage of which then funds Norway's military and public services. So having seen off the Dane 1,000 years ago, we're now paying for their navy many times over, including the generous pension plan. It's our net zero triple lock for Norway. Worse, the net zero transition is directly funding the Chinese Communist Party, which Ed Miliband's government has recently decided is merely a challenge, not a threat. We're all aware of Chinese global domination of the solar industry, panels particularly. About 97% of those used in the UK come from China, and some of those rely on forced or slave labour. And they're diversifying. Octopus Energy this last month signed a deal with the Chinese firm Mingyang Smart Energy, and that will put the first Chinese wind turbines into our waters. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in itself. We live in a global trading world, and that hopefully will help keep China honest. But do we really believe that these matters are disconnected from the government's efforts to offload the Chagos Islands to a Chinese ally, or to deliberately cause the collapse of a trial against Chinese spies in Parliament? Is Ed Miliband so monomaniacal in his pursuit of net zero that he's prepared to actively advance Chinese interests against those of Britain? It shouldn't even be a reasonable question, but it is. So in brief conclusion, Ed Miliband is actively undermining our access to the resources the UK military require in order to support all but the lightest of our international obligations to global security and home defence. And in doing so, he's enriching everybody bar the United Kingdom, including those actively hostile to our interests. He and his fellow ideologues already created the conditions by which Putin thought he could risk a 21st century war in Europe, and hundreds and thousands have died. We are in the UK surviving this madness, and that is the question before us today, but despite, not because of this government. I look forward then to rearming ourselves with affordable energy and turning the tide of history against the monsters. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And finally, Lord Orford.
Thank you, Harry. Okay, so I was a newly minted minister in 2021. I was brought in by Alistair Jack to come and join the Scotland office. I wasn't a politician, I was a business guy. And one of my first things I had to do was go to the COP in Glasgow in 2021. And I drank the Kool-Aid like everybody else. Net zero was just the coolest thing. And at the time, I was talking to the experts about what was this target, what did it actually mean. It was described to me that at the moment, at that time, 2021, the UK powers its whole energy system 75% hydrocarbon and 25% renewable. And the 2050 target spins it on its head and makes it 75% renewable and 25% hydrocarbon. So that seemed like a reasonable ambition without going into further detail, and that was that. I then went on and became a trade minister with Kemi, and then when Kemi became leader, she asked me to come into, as in the shadow position, in opposition, to come on to the energy brief. And asked me just to do a bit of a root and branch view of where we were. And the first thing I went back to was that target. Where are we? You know, in 75-25. 4 years later, the answer is 75-25. So the first thing is we ain't going to get to, we're not going to turn that on its head by 2050. That is just not going to happen. It's just physically not possible. And then the second thing, as you do the digging, is just the horror of the sheer uncompetitive position we put ourselves in terms of prices. That our electricity prices should be 7 times more expensive than China in a factory, running a factory in China, and 4 times more expensive than the US. How on earth can we be a leading nation with prices at that level, never mind the domestic scenario? And so that, I think the early conclusions of that work were just, the target is not going to happen, it's not achievable, and the way we're going about it is not affordable. And so we just take those 2 key principles, everything else flows from that. We have to redesign our system. We still can maintain a laudable aim to decarbonise and have the cleanest possible system. Our children have grown up with this idea, are not going to let go of it. And as generations come through, there will be a concept of trying to protect the planet. And yes, hydrocarbons may be a declining resource, although we'll keep finding more to discuss. But the reality is we can keep that as a laudable goal, but we should not be writing that into targets, and certainly not writing it into law, because it results in the law of unintended consequences, and it results in the great distortions you've heard already from Catherine. From a sort of local, sort of Scottish point of view, this thing all came home to me, of course, because of the North Sea. You know, there's 200,000 jobs in oil and gas in the UK, and 90,000 of those are in Scotland. And it's very local and personal for those of us who live up there, as we see these jobs, these are well-paid jobs, just being lost, or everyone just going overseas. And there is a very annoying little slogan that goes there, it's banded around by the SNP and by Labour, and it's called this thing called a just transition. Well, let me tell you, if you go to Aberdeen or you go to Grangemouth, there's nothing just about this transition. It's the most unjust concept you can see. And the OEUK recently came out with some analysis on this much vaunted switch where you can get the technical jobs to move from the oil and gas fields to the renewable fields. And what they're saying is that the rate of transfer is running at 58%, and salaries which are 2/3, sometimes lower. You know, if you're on the rigs as a rigger at 65 to 70k, you're coming onto wind farms, you're on 35 to 40k. It's just that is not a just transition. So the North Sea thing brought it home to me. And the second thing was I went to Grangemouth just to see, obviously quite local to me, not so much about the oil refinery, because the oil refinery is a 100-year-old chemistry set, which even the people working in it knows that it's got to the end of its useful life. And it was originally conceived to process oil brought in from Persia. BP, of course, was Anglo-Persian when it started. And the great myth was that this is an asset for Scotland to process North Sea oil. The oil refinery in Grangemouth has never processed North Sea oil. North Sea oil is a completely different chemistry set from Persian oil. But next door to that, there is a fracker. There's an ethylene plant. a big ethylene plant run by INEOS, which is, there's 40 of those in Europe, and it's probably second best of its type in Europe. And it is under threat of closure. It's very efficient, it's well run and well manned, but the combination of high energy prices and carbon taxes means that it's loss making. Now, if you picked up that ethylene cracker and dropped it into Texas, it would make a profit of $150 million a year. By being located in Grangemouth, it's break even to losing money. And that's the situation we've put ourselves in industrially, and that's now being replicated across the countries. We see job losses week in, week out, to the point now where, if the question is, can we survive Ed Miliband, the question really is, can Ed Miliband survive the unions? Because the unions are onto this now. Gary Smith at G&B is very clear that he is wiping out blue-collar jobs all over across the country. And so I think that the challenge for Ed Miliband is more from his own side, perhaps even it is from our side. This whole thing about the renewables are free. I remember being in a panel with, God rest his soul, my old, I was going to say pal, but my adversary, Alex Salmond, who would always say, you know, oh, the wind is free. You know, Scotland is Saudi Arabia of wind. You know, wind is free. And of course, as Catherine said, it's free at the point as it turns. The problem is how you get it to people's houses is certainly not free. And of course, one of the things that emerges because of the intermittency thing is that you've got the national grid was built sort of 30s, 40s, 50s in a triangle where basically the energy was produced in coal-fired power stations in Scunthorpe and then sent to the big conurbations, London, Birmingham, Manchester, etc., Glasgow, Edinburgh, and then remote up to, you know, down to Cornwall, up to north of Scotland. And so it was expensive to send it to Stornoway, right? Whereas it wasn't expensive to send it to Streatham because it was closer to Scunthorpe. You now build an energy system where you're collecting all energy out in the Highlands of Scotland, the North Sea and around into East Anglia. You've got to get that down to London. So you've got to build a reverse grid to bring all that now down on top. Now, if you were to say to me, well, the good news about that is that we're going to close the old grid because it's a bit old now, it's 80 years old, and we can shut that down and we can save money by building a new grid, or a reverse grid, to bring all this energy down from the north of Scotland down to London. That might just be about fine, except that you can't shut down the old grid because you need to continue the gas as your intermittency, as your backup. So you're actually duplicating, you're building one on top of the other. And as a result, we get these crazy scenarios where we're paying these wind farms to shut down, and curtailment payments. And Catherine is absolutely right. I mean, at what point in your life cycle does one start as a child, become an adolescent, become an adult? I mean, we've been subsidising these wind farms for 30 years. At what point are they weaned off their subsidy and become merchant? And that is, you know, an absolutely valid a challenge. So I think we can keep it's a laudable aim that we want to have the cleanest possible energy system. I think that is a good concept. China is doing well on its renewables. It's now at 30% renewables. But make no mistake, how they are doing that, they are using as their transition fuel, and this words they use, their transition fuel is coal. Okay, 70%. And they're opening a coal-fired power station one a week. And when we stopped burning coal in 1997, the world consumption of coal was 4 billion tonnes. Today it's 8 billion tonnes. So really goody two-shoes, fine that we got rid of our coal, but in the meantime, the rest of the world burns coal. They're using coal as their transition fuel. The US is using, obviously, shale gas as their transition fuel. What are we using as our transition fuel? Gas imported from Norway, from the fields right next to the ones that we own ourselves. Even the Norwegian energy minister thinks that's daft. Right? So our transition fuel could be gas, our own generated North Sea gas. It exists. There's plenty of it. We'll find more, and we can make it cheap. And we can run a system where people are incentivized to provide it cheaply to our domestic market. So there's plenty of options that we can do, but at the moment we've just got ourselves caught in ideology. And I think the key thing for the Conservative Party is that the Conservative Party did drink the Kool-Aid, and frankly over 14 years was a big part of this problem. And so therefore, one of the reasons why Kemi put me into this, because I said, why are you putting me on energy? He said, because you don't have any baggage on this. You know, I'm not part of the previous thinking. So I was able to give a very balanced view on what I think we need to do. And the result is, for those of you who heard Claire in the hall yesterday, was a very clear exposition of a new position, a new sensible position, a balanced scorecard. You know, Conservatives is about common sense, right? this has been hijacked by ideologues. Let's make this common sense. A balanced scorecard. We do want a cleaner energy system. There are new technologies coming, but let's allow these technologies to develop at their own pace. Let's not force them on man-made targets, which are not achievable. And if you want a little slogan, I was thinking a little slogan would be, we need to build nuclear. So if we were to push nuclear through to, say, 25% of our energy system, which is currently about 10% now, if we have renewables at about 25%, and if we have hydrocarbons at 50%, we can say 50-50 by 2050. How about that for a slogan, if that's what you want? So I think that, look, at the end of the day, will we survive Ed Miliband? The question is, will Ed Miliband survive even his own side? Because I think the scales are falling off the eyes now. Everyone's now looking at this completely differently. We're impoverishing ourselves on the altar of ideology, and thank goodness the Conservative Party has turned big time on this, and let's move forward to a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Offord. I think it's extraordinary to reflect on how fast the Conservative Party position has changed on net zero just from last year. But it certainly seems to be moving in a correct direction if policy seems to be getting worse at a national direction with Ed Miliband at the helm. We want to get through as many questions as possible, so if we take two at a time and we have succinct answers from our panellists, and we can make some good progress. Lady over that way in the third row, and lady at the front over here.
Hello, thank you. It's Rosie Beardmore from WWF. You spoke about the negative impact that net zero is having on the economy. I just wanted to ask if you can speak on the statistics by the CBI that the green economy supported almost 1 million jobs in 2024 and added 83.1 billion pounds in value to the UK, and the fact that businesses are increasingly investing in the green transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Over here.
Thank you. I'm Iona Parker. I'm from Braintree in Essex. Could I have your thoughts, please, on solar farms on greenfield sites? Thank you.
Well, do you want to start?
On the jobs point, this was one again back to COP in Glasgow. The biggest optimism around this was this idea that we were going to create really high-paid jobs. There's going to be a new green economy that everyone was going to share in. But the numbers coming out of, as I say, from the transition from the North Sea to this demonstrate that is not the case. I do believe that a well-run, a balanced scorecard economy, energy system, which will have green within it, can yield those jobs and will yield these jobs. My issue is the transition is too fast, it's not affordable, and it's set by man-made targets. I do believe there will be jobs to be had, but at the moment, all the supply chain for the green tech is overseas. It's not in the UK. So until we can answer that question of actually getting our own supply chain, where we're making our own. If you take, for example, the ScotWind sell-off that the S&P government did, where they sold 17 licences. They did that in a oneer, all to coincide around 2031. How much better have they done, like, say, 2 a year over, 7 years, to allow a supply chain to get embedded, to start supplying the first 2, then the next 4, then the next 6, and you build up to that by putting it all on a crush. All the manufacturers will do is go to the cheapest price, and the cheapest price is in China. So I do hold the hope of a green economy with good jobs, but at the moment that is not happening. In terms of the solar farms, this has been a big point of contention certainly in the House of Lords doing the revision of the bill, and the issue here is about prime agricultural land. And why are we taking prime? We've got land that we can put solar farms on. Fine, again, we don't make the solar farms. It's not our supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. But the issue here is where we put them. And there could be a whole brown field scenario for solar farms. There could even be an urban scenario for solar farms. You might even make it that it's being real conservative, that real people in real places and real businesses have this on their roofs. But why are you taking prime agricultural land out of supply when we don't have a properly food secure scenario? That's not a good idea.
Catherine.
Yeah, so on this question about green jobs, we don't have very many good green jobs, in fact. We have been closing some of the factories that actually produce green technology because our energy is so expensive. Almost everything for wind is produced in China. And recently, a fiberglass factory that was making wind turbine blades closed because of high energy costs. So all of this is just impossible while our cost of energy is so high. It's just not being. We are creating good green jobs, but they are not in Britain. And so unless we address this, it is just simply not adding up. And I completely agree on the solar. It makes no sense to use prime agricultural land because that is it's called prime agricultural land for a reason. And we have plenty of alternatives, so we should prioritise those.
Thank you. Andy?
So, as an economist, jobs are a cost, not a benefit. And to grow the economy, you need to be able to do what you've been doing before using fewer inputs, and that includes the number of people doing them. That's how manufacturing grows. What you're referring to is a green growth paradox, and it's the point Catherine made. If you have expensive energy, you don't have manufacturing, and that includes the supply chains for the wind, solar, nuclear industries. I will disagree with both other speakers that there are no good green jobs. There are two sectors in particular that have done fantastically out of net zero. One is the City of London. It turns out that if you guarantee profits from large capital projects on the taxpayer, you can create massive jobs for bankers and investors. Brilliant for them. The other group is lawyers. It turns out that if you can sue everybody, if anything that they do creates more emissions, then it's a boon day for people who want to take you to court. So we now have a situation in this country where you can build nothing with certainty. You could be taken to court and they could turn it around on the basis that you failed to consider the scope 3 emissions at the right stage of the process. So those are two areas where net zero has made a positive difference to some, but not, I would say, to the country. On the solar farm issue, I mean, I'm a libertarian, so I don't really want the government to be centrally planning land and telling people exactly what they can build and where. But if you want to stop solar being built inappropriately, it's very simple. You make solar and wind take account of the cost of their intermittency. If solar developers had to pay for the cost of the connection, if they had to pay for the cost of the backup technologies required when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, then you would have fewer solar farms and more appropriately sited solar farms in places where they can actually make a difference, which most of the time is in the Middle East.
Thank you.
So I'd like to just come back on this point about people investing in the green economy. They're doing that because it's subsidised. This is subsidy farming. And the subsidies regime is an enormous wealth transfer from the poorest people in society to rich developers. So there's a huge social justice question here as well as an economic inefficiency.
Thank you. Let's have a couple more. Gentleman at the back there and gentleman at the back over there.
Angus Allen, Colchester constituency. My background's food manufacturing, so I've got real-life experience of high energy costs. What's the panel's view on carbon capture? Because talking of subsidy farming, it seems to be a prime example.
David Berryman, Ribble Valley, but also lots of holes in the ground all over the world. How did we get into a position where you can get permission to drill an oil well and then not get permission to produce it?
Thank you.
I have a few other things as well, but yeah, we'll go with that.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to start this time?
So declared interest, I used to work for a large oil company that was involved in the early experiments on CCS, and the subsidy gap was always about £1 billion more than the government was prepared to offer. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the principle of CCF. If you have a carbon price in the economy, and the carbon price justifies investment in negative emissions technologies like CCS, then it's a logical way to decarbonise. But that's not the reality. I mean, Keynes once said that economic growth under definitions that the government used was digging holes and filling them in again, and that's what CCS is. It's not that useful. So it was originally something that we thought about doing because it would enable enhanced oil recovery. Putting the stuff back in the ground meant more oil came out. As merely a technology for carbon dioxide storage, I don't think it's viable. And if it is viable, then the place to test it is China, where they're producing much more CO2. And if they can make it work, great, and then we may all benefit because the stuff still matters. But at the moment in the UK, it's a fool's errand. On the second question...
On oil licenses, whether you could get a license to build a well, but then not actually be able to produce that.
Well, this is the point I was making earlier about climate lawyers, that we've created a regime of uncertainty through net zero and environmental permitting rules. It should be the case that if you want to build something, it should be a reasonably quick process to prove that it is something that should be built and the community agrees, and once that's agreed, you get on with it. Under the way that the rules now work, if you haven't considered absolutely everything that somebody now considers to be important, that decision can be reversed, and that was the case in Horse Hill.
Thank you. Catherine.
So carbon capture, Ed Miliband has decided now he's going to spend £22 billion of our money trying to succeed where other countries have failed, spending tens of billions of pounds. There are no large-scale carbon capture projects anywhere in the world that don't rely on hydrocarbon fuel production and processing for their economics. And there have been 5 power carbon capture projects where they've tried to capture the carbon dioxide from power stations. They're all with coal. All of them cost more than expected and captured less than expected. 4 have closed. Boundary Dam is the 5th, still operating, and they are using the carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery. It has never been done with gas power stations. The parasitic loads are significantly higher. It's a much more challenging engineering problem, and the economics are going to be even more difficult. There is absolutely no likelihood that Britain is going to make this succeed where everyone else has failed. And this is a prime example of where we should follow and not lead. One thing I would like to say about drilling and the North Sea is not directly in line with your question, because I think Andy just answered that. But because of the tax regime that we have now and because of the ban on new licenses, we are going to put ourselves in a situation where the North Sea goes into net decommissioning years earlier than expected. Now, our tax regime around decommissioning is that producers pay extra tax while the field is producing, and then when it goes into decommissioning, they get a rebate. The logic behind this is to make sure that those companies have money in their hands when they're decommissioning. So it's not a subsidy, it's their money that they're getting back. But the government didn't set this to one side. It wasn't put in a fund or anything. It was spent. So by bringing forward the net decommissioning position of the North Sea from the late 2030s, early 2040s, where it was, now it's going to be in the early 2030s. So in the middle of the next Parliament, Treasury is going to have to start funding a couple of £2-3 billion a year of cash out of the door to the North Sea instead of receiving billions of pounds in. And that's the economic reality of the current trajectory.
Thank you. Lord Offord.
I think both points have been answered. My only thing on CCS, carbon capture and storage, is this is part of the narrative or the ideology that can be quite alluring, and I fell for this myself. Back to my early days as Scotland Office Minister, I went up to Peterhead, to the power station up there at St Fergus, and I was proudly marched out to the edge of the periphery, and there's this pipeline, and it's called Goldeneye. And there's a photograph of me standing beside Goldeneye in my James Bond high-vis jacket. And this is a pipeline that is now redundant, but it goes out to the original North Sea oil fields. And it sounds such a wonderful idea. You bring oil and gas into the UK, you use what you need, you clean it up, you take the carbon, and then you send it back via Goldeneye back to where it came from. And the geology of the North Sea around Scotland and Norway particularly allows for this to be put back in and stored, for example, where the Ruhr Valley can't do that. So you had this idea that we could become a world leader in storage of everybody else's dirt as well. We could take it in from Germany and Europe and put it into... So it was a great idea, and it sounded very alluring, and intellectually it seems to answer the question. But, as we've heard, the economics just simply do not stack up.
Thank you. Should we have a couple more? Gentleman in the second to back row there, and lady at the front here.
Hello, Tony Janio, Chairman down in the Socialist Republic of Brighton and Hove. Yes, I understand from the government's point of view the Net Zero and Climate Change Act, you've got to take people in this country away from it slowly, so you're talking about the finance and it's unaffordable. If you were to just scrap it all immediately, you'd lose most of the people, probably some of the people in this room, who believe the science. But as a physicist by training and a politician by interest, I I don't believe that the poor old carbon dioxide molecule is responsible for boiling the planet. The fact that there was a small rock rotating round a massive ball of fusion and with all the solar flares and energy is probably more to do with the rise in temperatures. My question is, you're going to have to slowly move the country away from carbon dioxide. I understand you haven't done it at the moment because to do that would be just too much. When do you anticipate that we're going to take the country away from carbon dioxide is boiling the planet?
Thank you. And over here.
I might try and answer that question, hopefully sooner rather than later, mainly because we're losing jobs today across a wide range of sectors. You've mentioned about Minios and Grangemouth, Sabic in the northwest, pottery companies, ceramic companies. These are businesses that have grown over a multitude of years and also have key capabilities. So you mentioned the ethylene plant. You know, hydrocarbons are the still critical source for the multitude of carbon materials that I think, Andy, you know well about as well today. So my question is really about the urgency of taking some change of direction, but perhaps to that gentleman's point, doing it in a way we can take people with us, you know, in a reasoned way. But this is not something that we can continue to let happen for the next 12 months. We will continue to lose jobs and key capabilities.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to start with those?
So, addressing both points, I mean, one of the things that I do is lecture in schools about free market environmentalism. So the science of global warming is real. It is a serious problem. It's something that we need to address. But I'm a climate optimist. I believe that these problems will be addressed through the process of invention and innovation, just as every other environmental and social challenge has been. And one of the things that I sometimes do is I put into AI what the UK will look like if there are 2 or 3 degrees of global warming. And the first picture that comes back is of the north, and you can see the vineyards stretching down the hills and lovely sunshine. And it's a bit of a problem for the way that global warming has been presented in this country, that actually we're one of the places where fewer people would die as a result, because we are mainly exposed to cold weather, not hot. And that's not obviously everybody, but it is the general picture. I thought this is too optimistic. So the other place that I put into the AI was Brighton. And there, happily, for balance, it showed that the entire place was sinking down underwater. But that, I think, is because the Socialist Republic of Brighton wouldn't have built the seawalls that they needed to build if the sea levels were rising. And that's rather the point. Most of the problems associated with global warming can be dealt with. They can be dealt with by measures that are far cheaper than trying to change the entire basis of the global economy at a pace to which we are not suited. I believe in the future we will not be burning oil and gas for energy. We will have a combination of nuclear, renewables and other stuff we have not yet envisaged. But that is not today, and by trying to centrally plan it and force the pace to a fixed timeline, that is how we're getting into the economic problems.
Catherine.
I mean, as I said in my opening remarks, our net zero policy makes the climate problem as it's described worse, because offshoring is making emissions go up. So I don't understand why we have a communication challenge around this. It's almost we don't have to get into that discussion around carbon dioxide. We have to explain that the current net zero policy makes emissions go up and makes us poorer and puts more people into fuel poverty. So up until about 2021, the government was collecting data on excess deaths each winter from fuel poverty, and between 6,000 and 8,000 people every year in Britain die prematurely as a result of fuel poverty. Making that problem worse in the effort to minimise harm from climate change is perverse, right? Why would you cause harm to prevent harm? That makes no sense. So I think there are very, without even needing to get into that debate about climate change, what we're doing now just doesn't work on any level, and we should change it. And then the question about hydrocarbons. So my personal view is that burning oil is quite a waste because it's an incredibly useful thing. But at the moment, we do need to. And when I get very frustrated with people who say they want to just stop oil because they seem to want to stop oil universally. If you go into a hospital, there's really nothing in a hospital apart from the people that's not made out of oil. If you are going to have chemotherapy, you walk through a door made out of oil, on a floor made out of oil, past walls covered in oil, looking through windows made out of oil, sit on a chair made out of oil, while a tube made out of oil connects you to a machine made out of oil, which puts drugs made out of oil into your body. So yes, chemotherapy drugs and almost every other drug used in modern medicine is made out of oil. So I personally don't want to stop oil.
Thank you. I would just add, and this I think relates to the point about green jobs as well. You don't actually advance the cause of decarbonisation by sheltering technologies from competition. You know, other countries aren't going to be able to replicate the subsidies that we see here, certainly not in the developing world. So ultimately, that does not create a vibrant green economy, and it slows any potential transition that you might see. Just on a political front, you know, it is a sort of legitimate question as to whether the Conservatives are moving faster than where the public are in terms of, you know, will they be able to appreciate the nuances of this new position, or will they interpret that as a just climate skeptic, maybe climate denying kind of strategy? And how will you explain that to the public?
Yeah. So I have the great benefit of not being elected. As I say, I've been selected, not elected. And the result is I can say to my elected colleagues some things that they find a bit weird. So I say, for example, can we just take the politics out of this? What do you mean? Well, can we just, we want cheaper energy, don't we? I mean, everybody wants that, don't they? I mean, why is that need to be political football? So the way to deal with this, I think, is to do it just through the sheer lens of the economy and prosperity in everybody's lives. We don't need to get into an argument about ideology. We do want the cleanest possible energy system we can have, so long as we're not impoverished. We want the cleanest energy system we can have, so long as we have got prosperity and jobs, and we can run factories, and we can re-employ people. We need to reindustrialise it. We're going to build all this extra defence spending going from 2% to 5%. How are we going to do that when we can't afford to run factories? So I think take the politics out of this. Let's talk common sense about jobs, about the cost of living, about heating your house. I think Catherine's absolutely right. This is the biggest transfer of money from poor people to rich people I've seen. And the last point on the hospital point is that in the future, how would the slogan go? Make sure you get your appointment on a windy day.
Thank you, Lord Offit. I think we've got time for about 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. So, gentleman at the back there, and over here.
Hello, Andrew Whale, Altrincham. How do you break the stranglehold of the net zero industry, who now self-sustain themselves? I'm talking about academia and industry who've jumped on the bandwagon.
Thank you.
Nathan Evans, Altrincham and Sale West. How do we flip it on its head, given we've got so much farmland handed over? We have built so many wind farms, which in due course will need replacing at horrendous cost. And are they actually delivering long term? Is it just a short term fig leaf, basically?
I think on that one we just go straight to level playing field. At the moment we've got a Ponzi scheme. We've got a man-made rigged system where some people get punished and some people get rewarded. So oil and gas gets punished, 78% tax. This thing called excess profits levy is a complete anachronism because there's no profits, never mind excess profits, right? And then people get rewarded by building wind farms in places nowhere near any populations that get paid to switch off. So if we made this a level playing field, made it a merchant scenario, made people have to compete with each other on a level playing field, we could fix this actually pretty fast, I would say.
If I could add my final question for you, Lord Offord, which is on AR7. Claire Coutinho said yesterday about the need not to sign new contracts with renewables, the so-called allocation round 7, which are part of the CFD contracts for renewables. They threaten to add huge amounts on people's bills, stretching 20 years into the future. How do you think we should proceed on that front?
Well, it's scary because that's coming up in the next 6 to 12 months. And they've been extended from 15 years to 20 years. They are going to be legally binding contracts. That's embedded then into our system. For me, we can't go. Any responsible government has to respect, contracts signed in good faith, etc. To me, the way to deal with this is that we have no further expansion on wind farms, and we get our gas going. We get North Sea gas. We have to rehabilitate gas. Okay, we have the ability to produce our own domestic supply of gas and make that cheap, and the economics of that will be what get us out of this hole. And if we do that, I think that's got to be the first priority.
Thank you, Catherine.
So I slightly disagree on AR7. I agree that we have to respect contracts, but AR7 contracts have not yet been signed. And I think that we've heard this from Reform already, saying that they would look at potentially tearing them up if they don't think they're in the public interest. And with Claire's comments yesterday, that was indicating that she's considering a similar course. Entities in Britain, if they are exposed to losses, before they can claim damages, they're supposed to mitigate their loss. So if you sign a contract and you've been told that the parties, one of whom is likely to form the next government, have said that these contracts will potentially not be honoured, how are you mitigating your losses if then you go ahead and sign them? And I would say that they are in that circumstance not being signed in good faith. So I would completely oppose tearing up contracts that already exist today, but I think that the industry needs to be given a very strong message that the days of these huge subsidies are numbered, and that signing up more and bigger and longer subsidies now is not in the public interest, and a party that is wanting to protect the public interest will take appropriate action. And so that's my position on AR7. I agree with the comments about gas. I think that we absolutely have the potential to revitalise our North Sea gas. We can also look at fracking. I caution around fracking that it is not, the appraisal work hasn't been done yet. So a lot of people think that it's a silver bullet. What we really need is to remove the seismic restrictions, put them back to somewhere sensible. 0.5 is ridiculous. 3.5 would be more sensible. We do need proper rules around water usage, because we don't have lots of spare water in this country, so we must make sure that we don't misuse water for that purpose. But then otherwise we should allow the market to deploy its own capital and find out if we have viable shale resources. But we actually can also do conventional drilling on land. We already do, so we could do more of it and expand the North Sea, and that will bring significant benefits. It doesn't necessarily lower domestic bills, but it brings huge amounts of revenue into the Treasury and avoids this, tax bombshell that's going to come with decommissioning if we don't reverse this decline. So that would be my strategy.
Thank you, Catherine. And to close up, Andy.
Yeah, very briefly. So I agree with all the previous points made about AR7 and regulation. Just on the one point that was asked about how you change the culture. Well, stopping the money is crucial to that. And as someone who was active in the CBI for about 15 years, when you do that, the CBI will change. I mean, they are often perceived as being the next level for the NUS. So all the Labour future spads and ministers that graduate from the NUS go to the CBI to do some of their first jobs and get exposed to the real economy. It's very exciting for them. But the politics is realigning. So it's a much more plural field now. And the CBI will be looking around thinking maybe we shouldn't just be a representative group for large industries that are rent-seeking off subsidies. Maybe we should actually look at real business again and growth. So I suspect the CBI will change very quickly when the policy changes.
Thank you, Andy. Just finally to say there's some Global Warming Policy Foundation reports at the back of the room there. Please do feel free to take one or to check out our website, thegwpf.org, where we have a full selection of reports on energy and climate subjects. So finally, if I could just have a big round of applause for our excellent panelists.